All right, let's talk about a little bit of terminology. When you go to log on to a computer or to sign on to a computer on a network, you have to go through authentication. Because in order to access a network, a user must first be authenticated. This is kind of like having a doorman at your building or a security officer. Instead of just being able to walk into the building and go anywhere you want, that person will stop you and ask for ID. They'll check against a list and they'll say, well, do I recognize this person? If they do, good things happen. If they don't, not so good things happen. Well, authentication is the job of the server, and it's doing the job of a security person or a doorman. First of all, it checks to see if the user is recognized. If the user is not recognized, they don't get to go any further. If they are recognized, then the server goes on to check and see what permissions the user has. What resources can they access, and what can they do with what they can access? For example, if I'm a salesperson in a company, I probably should not be allowed to access HR files, but I should be able to access our sales sheets. So I might have full access to anything in the sales folder, but no access to anything in the HR folder. The server is going to authenticate a user, including identifying them, possibly giving them permission if they're recognized, and then also dictating which permissions they have for which resources. The user does this by providing a username and password as identification when they log on to a system. That's why it's very important to keep your username and your password private, so that nobody can log on, basically with identity theft, and making the computer think that they are somebody else. A LAN is called a local area network for a reason. With a local area network, all of the computers and resources are usually in a fairly restricted geographical area. As I said, this could be in a single office or maybe in a single building. But when you want to cover longer distances, it gets to be difficult. I think you can imagine that while it's possible for me to string a cable from one computer in one room to the next computer in the next room, it's not possible for me to string the same cable between New York and LA. When we talk about covering the distance, we talk about expanding the local area network to something known as a wide area network, or a WAN. I've given you just kind of one example here, but remember, the possibilities are endless about how this could be configured. We can have a domain with its own server for the ABC company in New York City, and that one has a couple of computers and a printer as well as a server. And as long as they just need to share information with each other, they stay local. Their server handles everything that they need to. On the other side, we have the domain for the ABC company in LA. They also have their own server, but they're a little bit bigger. They have a couple of computers that are part of the HR group, and then they have 3 computers that are part of the sales group. So this domain is broken down into 2 different work groups. The work groups have certain permissions shared amongst themselves, but they also can share information back and forth between HR and sales as is appropriate based on what the server allows. When these 2 domains need to talk to each other, in other words, when New York City needs to talk to LA, that's when the 2 servers begin to speak to each other. Because they are a physical distance apart, and because they can't use just a simple cable to connect themselves, they have to use some different technology, this is known as a WAN, or a wide area network. So how does all of that network connectivity happen? Well, this is where it can get very complicated. So just kind of go with the overall concepts here. Don't worry about memorizing a lot of terminology. The general definition of a WAN is covering some distance, but remember that that can mean many things. It could be between 2 buildings within a city. It could be across town. It could be between states, or even between 2 countries. Various technologies can be used, though, to create peer-to-peer networks, LANs, domains, or LANs to WANs. And that's where we get into all kinds of wonderful technologies, everything from actual cabling to phone lines and even satellites. In order to connect the network, though, we have to use some particular equipment. A peer-to-peer network may require just a single cable between 2 computers. Now, as we said, that certainly is possible, but it's really not that common anymore. Instead, people have gotten a little bit more elegant or polished, even with small home networks. Most networks require 2 to 3 pieces of hardware. Now, this is where I start to say to all of the IT people who may be listening, I know, this is a simple version, but this is all we need to know for this particular course. At a minimum, to create a network, you need a network card, a network cable, and some kind of device to connect and manage the connections. We start off with the network card. The network interface card, which is shortened to NIC, manages the network connections and communicates at the PC level. It can fit into a slot on the motherboard. It can use an auxiliary slot at the back of the CPU case, or it can even be an external port, possibly fitting into your USB drive. With a traditional NIC, we're going to have some type of network cable, often called a Cat5 cable, that connects the NIC to the network device. Now, when you talk about cables, you can go down to any of your home improvement stores these days and buy a network cable, or of course you can go to an electronics store. But Cat5 is kind of the most common type. There are different types of cables and medium in which to create networks, but this is kind of the consumer level. You also may have wireless capabilities, but there still has to be a physical NIC somewhere. It just doesn't require a cable between the computer and the network device. For example, my laptop has a port that I can connect a Cat5 cable to. And when I'm at home, I do that because it's the safest, most secure, and fastest way to connect. But when I'm traveling, I also have a wireless NIC, or a NIC with wireless capability, that's inside the case of my laptop. I never get to see it, but I simply press a switch on the top of my laptop, and then it's able to connect wirelessly. The technology is still the same, but you have to have wireless capabilities built in before you can use a wireless NIC.